Greetings and thank you for joining me today. I have a message God's given me and I believe He wants to speak to you. So all I ask is that you open up your heart and say right now, Lord, if you want to speak to me, speak. I'm listening. I pray you're going to enjoy this message. John 3:7-8 says, "You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases, you hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit." We who are born again, born of the Spirit, need to understand that a life in the Spirit is not a sedentary life. It's a life of change. God can and will move you in different ways and by different means to get you to the place where He has for you so that you can be effective in the kingdom purpose He has for your life. We should not be surprised that like the wind, it changes directions quickly and that it can blow strong and later become perfectly still. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation, but more than likely, if you've been saved more than a year in your life, you have had those moments where all you could do was wait upon the Lord. It just becomes part of the life. We want things to happen and say, Lord, when will this take place? When will you fulfill your promise? When will you hear? And we basically, many times, there's complete silence on the other end. Not because God doesn't love us, but basically we often ask the wrong question. The question is, when are you going to move? The question is, what are you trying to teach me during this time? What are you trying to train me in? Do you know the one thing that most Christians have the most difficulty being trained in is patience? Don't ever pray for patience. God will answer that one quicker than any other request you can make. Because there is a need for us to understand that this is not a situation where we snap our fingers and God turns into the genie in the bottle. We're on His time schedule. He works all things together for good. We can't work them. We can't make them work. You can stand commanding that mountain to move. If it's not supposed to move, you're not going to move it. In fact, I love a message that my former pastor, David Godwin, talked about, that there are mountains to command and there are mountains to climb. There are mountains that you just simply have to climb them. And it takes a lot of patience to climb that mountain. And the fact is, in our lives, we need to understand that the timing and the seasons of God, that for everything there's a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. And God has purposes for you, and you may feel like that He's forgotten about you. But He's not forgotten about you. He is still working to will and do of His good pleasure. It just won't be on your time schedule. And the best thing you can do is to try to understand why the delay. You see, our steps are ordered of the Lord. And those steps are sometimes many in a row. And then they come to a place where you just have to stand. One of the people I've respected for many years, who was a big part of my life, and I loved her during the days we went to church together, and I respected her because she was a woman of wisdom. Her name was Judy Doyle. And she made the statement that she said, God's never late, but He misses golden opportunities to be early. And in our mindset, those golden opportunities to be early are those times that we really want God to move now and He doesn't. And so what happens? We wait. And if we're going to be able to function in what God does as He is moving by the Spirit, then we need to learn how to bend with the wind. We need to learn how to flow with Him. The thought of this originates with an understanding of Matthew 13 in Jesus' story about the tares and the wheat. Now, I'm not going into what the tares are, what the wheat is. I'm talking about in this aspect of how tares respond and how wheat responds. You see, when they come to full maturity, you can tell the tares by the blowing of the wind. Because wheat bends. It bends with the wind. Tares have a lot stronger stalk to them, and they stand upright, and they don't move. It's a picture of resisting, and there's a picture of yielding. We must learn to yield to the wind that God blows. Because I promise you, if you're going to be used of God in some way, some form or fashion, and I'm not talking about called into the fivefold ministry, I'm talking about functioning in your purpose in your church, then you're going to have to learn to bend with the wind. As we mature, we must be prepared for those sudden changes in direction that God will inspire. We have to be prepared that sometimes God may even move you from one church to the next for the sake of you fulfilling a purpose there that would not have been fulfilled in the other place. God will move you in directions and in places, and transitionist change is just a part of walking with God. Let me tell you about my life in ministry, and I'll give you a little understanding of it. When I got married, I was attending and was married in the church that I grew up in, the church my dad grew up in, the church that my grandmother was there in the very first stages of that church. And yet, when I got married, about 6 months in, God says, it's time to leave this church. And I said, why? He said, because you will never become the man I've called you to be in the environment that you grew up in. I have to take you into a different place to mature you in your ministry. It was not an indictment of the church. It was an indictment of the fact that as long as I was comfortable doing the same things, I would not have the capacity or the capabilities of changing into what God intended for me. Well, before we got turned into the first year of marriage, we were gone from the church. I talked to the pastor. I told him we were leaving. I told him God has directed us to move into a different direction. And as we moved and we're going in the ministry, we were out preaching, and things were good. God was moving, God was helping us. But as we were moving out in ministry, it wasn't like everything just blew up. We saw miracles. We saw a person get out of a wheelchair and walk, a person that had rheumatoid arthritis and had been in bed for 6 months. They walked. It wasn't like we weren't seeing God move, but we knew that there was something more that God was calling us to. And so we cried out to the Lord. And about our 4th year into our ministry and our marriage, we started seeking God, and God said, I want you to go to this place and hear this minister. And so we didn't know how we were going to get there. My dad had been invited to this minister, and his dad, this minister's dad, had been my dad's interpreter in South Africa when my dad preached there. And my dad had been invited. My dad said, I'm not going to be able to go, but if you find the way to get there, you go. And a person came up to us a few days later and said, I have $1,000 for you. And we were able to buy the tickets. We were able to get a hotel and be able to go there. And we went to those services there, and we started out, and it was a winter camp meeting. It was January of 1994. But God was moving. They'd previously had a 16-week or more revival with this one minister. His name's Rodney Howard Brown. And in those services, God began touching us and ministering to us and revealing himself. In fact, God touched us in a way far deeper than we had ever been touched. Well, I got to meet Rodney, and my wife and I spent some time with him. And because he knew my dad and who he was and knew who I was, we talked. And he asked me a question. He said, what are you going to do when you go back? And I said, I believe we're going to go back and have revival. Well, God has directed me to call the youth pastor of the church we were attending. And I called him up and I said, I believe God's given me a word for your youth. God has spoken something into my spirit. And so we talked together. We set up on February 2nd of that year. We set up on a Wednesday night to be able to go and minister his youth. He had about 65 kids in his youth group. God had given me a direction and told him, I said, when we start out, when you're about to call me up, just sing a couple of songs. I have a song I want you to sing. It was a song called Glorify Thy Name. Well, while he's singing it, he takes his glasses off, wipes them, puts them back on, does that again later. I didn't know what that was about. In fact, I didn't even think anything about it at that time. But I found out later, while he was singing it the first time, he saw what looked to be a cloud enter the room and go over the heads of the kids. But he actually thought his glasses were fogging up. So he wiped them off and put them back on, but then he saw the cloud still there. And then he saw, as he was finishing that song, the cloud drop on those kids. I got up and I preached the message God had given me to preach. I had talked to a young man. I said, if you could just stand behind these kids as I pray for them, and if they fall, just catch them and lay them gently on the floor. And he didn't know what I was talking about. At that time, this was not normal for that church. Well, I preached. God had given me the first person on the Sunday before we were in the church, and God said, pray for him first. So they all lined up, and I called him up though first, and I said, I want to pray for you. I laid hands on him, and the power of God hit him, and he flailed out on the floor. The next person, I prayed for them. They fell out on the floor, and God began ministering into that place. It was interesting. My wife said she would look at kids who are laughing and talking, and she said she'd look back at them 30 seconds later, and they were crying, and their hands were raised up. That day, that service, the majority of those kids were out on the floor under the power of God, including the pastor's kids. We had an altar call. People gave their heart to God. Then I prayed for them. They fell out under the power of God. Well, the service was going on, and it was getting late for a Wednesday night. And so parents started sending up the brothers or sisters to come upstairs to get the kids. And they would pass by, and they'd come in, and God say, lay hands on them. I lay hands on them. They began falling out on the power of God. We had a whole group of younger brothers and sisters in the back. And about 15, 20 minutes later, parents started coming up because where is my son, my daughter, where are the kids I set up to them? And they stood in the back and just stared at what was going on as God was pouring out his Spirit in that place. The service, which was supposed to end at 9 o'clock, was still going on at 11 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, the pastor came upstairs because somebody went down and told him, you need to come upstairs. He went upstairs, and I had known him for a long time, and he saw his children out under the power of God. And so he says, can you start a service on Sunday, and we'll just see where it goes? I said, I believe that's exactly what God intended. You see, what I knew was these kids were ready for it. The church wasn't at that moment in time. That Sunday, the power of God hit. The pastor fell out under the power of God for the first time in his entire ministry, entire life. Other people were touched, and we began a 4-week revival where people had visions of fire coming down from heaven. People saw the power of God falling all through that place. When we left that revival, the very last time, that last service, if we finished on a Sunday night, and the person who locks up the church was there talking to somebody, they turned the lock and fell out under the power of God, and they had to drag him to his car and help him get home. Well, from there on, we began having revivals. We would have 7-week revivals, 4-week revivals, 10-week revivals. God started moving. It was wonderful. It was powerful. We saw these things happening. It was a complete transition and change for our life. Everything had to get set aside for this. And it went on for many, many, many years, but then we slowly started seeing it change. And I wasn't ready for that. It was slowing down. You see, we can talk about revival. Let me tell you about revival. There comes a point in time where you have to live on the level that God takes you to. And if you don't live on that level, you can fall off and back into things that you should have never gotten involved in. Well, we were just seeing it drying up, but we were crying out to God. We were saying, God, what should we do? How are we going to do this? Where do you want us to go? Where do you want us to be? How are we going to do? And God spoke to me and said, I want you to pastor a church. And I said, Father, can I have a burning bush on that? Because as an evangelist, I couldn't tell you the number of times I walked away from churches thinking, I'm so glad I'm not a pastor, you know. And now he's calling me the pastor. I said, why? He said, because your daughters need you now. You see, when I was traveling, I'd be gone from them for a period of time. My daughters were entering that 12 and 10 age. And God says, your daughters need you now. They need their dad. And after going through something, we found the church, the one I am at currently. And I started pastoring it. Had a lot of questions of whether I'd even be able to. But for the time from then to now, I was able to be a part of my daughters' lives. I was able to be a dad to them. I saw them graduate. I've since had one of my daughters get married, and the other daughter has moved off. She's 1,200 miles away from me right now. But we talk all the time, and I recognize that the relationship changed because God's will and purpose changed. And I had to bend with it. I couldn't fight against it. Fighting against it only made things last longer in the waiting period. And I want to tell you, there is a point in time where you just have to just bend with the wind, knowing that God's got you. He'll take care of it, and He's going to move by His Spirit in your life, and He's going to take you places that are not for evil, but are for good. Will there be more changes for me? I don't know. But my life requires that I learn to bend with the wind and go the direction God has for me. And that's what it's all about. My ability to adapt myself to His will, because He will never adapt Himself to mine. So I ask you, what about you? What about your life? Maybe your life is getting stagnant, and the reason it's getting stagnant, God wants to shift you in a different direction. He wants to move you in a way you've never really thought about moving in. Maybe He wants to do something even like you did with me in that church you've been attending for all this time. God's saying, I got something for you, but you've got to go this direction. Or maybe it's some aspect of ministry or work that you've never done. Maybe God wants to take you and put you out of one place into another place where financially He can bless you to the point that you can begin supporting missionaries and ministries and be able to help them, to help a church begin to rise up. Maybe God's got something more for you than what you can see for yourself. And my encouragement would be today that if you're in a point where you feel stuck, if you're in a place where you feel there is no movement, if you're in a place where you just feel caught in between a rock and a hard place, I want to tell you that's the place you say, God, whatever your will is, whatever you desire, whatever you want to do, because let the wind blow. I'm not going to fight the wind. I'm going to bend with it. I'm not going to fight what you do. I'm going to yield myself to it. I want to be in the center of what you have for me. My desire is to be everything you desired for me. There is no place in your life that you will have more joy than being set in a place that you know is where God has for you. See, that's the place you begin to get dreams and visions. That's the place God speaks a word. It's the place where you have yielded yourself fully and said, not my will, yours be done. It's that place where you are strengthened by God because you have yielded yourself to live your life in accordance with what His will is. And in that place, you see things differently than you did before. You hear Him more clearly than you did before. God starts moving you. And I know that there's changes coming. I know there's a revival that God's going to send. I've had visions of it. I've had visions of the things that God's going to do. I have been blessed of God to have Him speak to me words concerning the things that we're heading toward in our future. I have been blessed beyond measure. I know there is something of prophetic significance that we're going through today that is nothing more than preparation for where we're going to go tomorrow. You see, during this time of coronavirus, I want to tell you, God's going to put within your hands healing. And you're going to begin to walk in healing. And people are talking about it can come back in the fall, it can come back in the winter. Let me tell you something. It is that we need to be prepared for, that in that moment that it tries to come back, we begin dealing with it by the Spirit and under the authority of the Holy Spirit. And we're unwilling to allow the enemy to bring back what has been taken away, what he tried to put upon us. See, there's a point in time where in standing for God, we have a backbone of iron. In standing for God, we set our face like flint. But in walking with God, we stay yielded. I am hard toward the enemy, but I am soft toward him. I can worship God with tears pouring down my face and turn in the next second and begin rebuking the devil with everything that's within me, because I know who my enemy is and I know what he's trying to do and I know his purposes and plans, and I'm not going to just stand there and let it happen. But with God, I let it happen because I know he has the best for me. He's got the best for you. I want to pray for you right now, that as you move into the next thing that God has for you, that you're going to discover the leading of the Lord, and you're going to learn to bend with the wind. Father, I pray for every person that's watching this today, that's listening to the message you've laid upon my heart, and I feel your presence right now as I'm ministering it. I ask you, Lord, come through the means that they are using to watch this, and Lord, flow into them. Draw them. Lord, be their Lord, their King. Guide them to the places you have for them. Prepare them for the things you want to do in and through them. And Lord, by your power and might, establish your work in them, that they might fulfill the purpose you've called them to and might know the joy of service to the Lord. I thank you for it. I praise you for it in Jesus' name. And I bless your people now to go forth and do all that the Lord is calling you to do. Well, I'm going to give you some information in just a moment of how you can get in contact with us. And so I'm going to ask that you just stay with, don't pause it, don't get off, please just stay and listen to this. I would like to hear from you. Maybe you would like to send a letter. I'll tell you how to get in touch with us. Through email, through letter. But let me hear from you. God bless you. Thank you so much. May the Lord bless you richly is my prayer. Well, I pray that the message blessed your life today and God touched you through it. I want to just tell you that if you don't have a home church, I want you to know that we are New Life Assembly of God, and I'm Pastor Tommy Nunn, and we're at 1339 North Duncanville Road in Duncanville, Texas. And you can come at 10:30 on Sunday mornings and be a part of our congregation and just sit and listen and worship with us and see if the Lord would speak to you to be a part of it. Now, if you already have a home church, I pray that you would still come back and listen to what the Lord's laid upon my heart to speak to you about, and I pray that it would be a blessing to you. And if it is a blessing to you, I'd appreciate you sending me a letter. If you have a prayer request, send me your prayer request so I can pray for it. If you want to support this in some way, that would be also appreciated. And you can do all of that by writing us at New Life Assembly of God, Pastor Tommy Nunn, 1339 North Duncanville Road, Duncanville, Texas, 75116. I will pray over every request. We will send you receipts for anything you send. I will respond to your request and let you know we're praying for. I will take those words of encouragement that you send because God used it, and I will mention them to others, and I'll pass them along. I'll even do a video of just talking about the people God has touched and thanking them for writing me. Please be a part if you can. Subscribe to this message. Subscribe to the ministry. I believe God will bless you. Thank you so much.